Thank you for registering for our free course called AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate Guide to Success. In this course, you'll be able to understand the contents of AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam and learn the preparations needed to pass in the shortest possible time. The goal of this course is to help you prepare for the AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam and to learn what you need to do in order to achieve your goals in the shortest possible time. As with any exam preparation, you'll need to understand and study the content to ensure your success. But this course only requires that you make necessary preparations to pass in an efficient time while still getting a strong overall score. Let's look at some of the background information regarding the course and its concept. Already, Udemy has a number of courses for associate exams. Most of these courses are AWS hands-on courses, so the attendance time is quite long. Our company also has a hands-on lecture course, but this takes more than 26 hours. The lectures alone will take 26 hours, and when you add your own personal hands-on experience, it can take well over 30 hours to complete. Some of the more popular Udemy associate exam courses, which have hundreds of thousands of users, can take well over 18 hours, 24 hours, and the longest course on Udemy is around 83 hours to complete. It can easily take at least 30 hours to complete, which include the hands-on experiences. In order to pass the exam, actually, it is also necessary to take additional mock exams. This will help you practice the kinds of questions that will come up in the exam. Without this mock exam practice, maybe around 2 or 3 times, I don't think it's possible for you to pass. It can take a tedious amount of time to complete all of this. The lectures, the hands-on demonstrations, your personal AWS hands-on experience, and then the mock exams on top of this. What if there was a better way? This course, however, is designed to make up for the shortcomings of the long and time-consuming associate exam courses. We will aim for the shortest and most structured way to pass the exam. The procedure is to first analyze the range of questions in the exam that will actually be asked, also checking for the range of questions that will frequently appear. Then, by studying only the range of questions to be asked, we will eliminate unnecessary learning and aim to pass the exam in the shortest amount of prep time. First, let's quickly look at the contents of this course. What is AWS? In this lecture, you'll gain an understanding of the cloud services provided by AWS. AWS Certification Overview. In this lecture, you'll learn the AWS certification structure, the position of AWS's Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam, and how it fits in. Associate Exam Overview. In this lecture, you'll learn about the scope and the format of the Associate's exam and the skills needed to pass. Test Experience. In this lecture, you'll get experience and review official AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam questions, like those you're likely to see in the exam. The scope of the Associate's exam. In this lecture, based on the 14 questions you've reviewed in the test experience, we'll explain the question trends of the Solutions Architect Associate exam in detail. AWS Overview. In this lecture, you'll learn about the basic mechanism of AWS, the Global Service System. The scope of AWS services. In this lecture, you'll learn about AWS services covered in the exam, categorized by the frequency of questions about them, based on an analysis of 1,625 associate exam questions. Next Steps to Success, our bonus lecture. In this lecture, we'll introduce the next steps, our course called Shortest Path to Success, specially designed to secure a successful pass in the Associate's exam with the shortest preparation time needed. Let's begin. What is AWS? In this lecture, you will get an overview of AWS and how it works. AWS is a service that allows you to instantly use functions required for infrastructure development and application development, anytime, anywhere. AWS can be very useful, for example, in a situation where you need to use a server right away. Physical servers are sometimes called on-premise servers. These take a considerable amount of time to select, purchase, and install. However, if you were to use AWS, you could immediately get access to a virtual server called an EC2 on the internet. AWS has the ability to provide this EC2 server so you can use it anytime on demand. In addition to servers, infrastructure like storage and databases can also be requested instantly on AWS. It's possible to use a storage that can store unlimited data using S3 within minutes. AWS also has a variety of database services like RDS and DynamoDB. You can use these to create the optimal database for each case. It is also a feature of AWS that this infrastructure can be instantly built on demand throughout various regions around the world. On-premise servers take a considerable amount of time to set up, and the initial cost is quite high. Some physical servers cost more than $10,000 each. However, on the cloud, you can easily use it for free at first, and it can be built within a few minutes. In the past, to maintain a system or infrastructure within a company, you had to physically install a server or database in either a data center or a server room, and set up the network infrastructure to support it. These time-consuming physical systems were needed to do what we can do now over the cloud in minutes. If you were to use AWS, you could configure a system that performs exactly the same services as a data center in no time at all. Once again, the greatest feature of AWS services is that you can create such a system anywhere in the world through the internet. Sets AWS apart from the other cloud providers is that you can create and use servers in the United States, Europe, Asia, and other areas instantly. While there are domestic cloud companies that you can use in most countries, these companies have a very limited range of deployment for their cloud services and are usually limited to their own individual countries. In addition to AWS, global cloud services like Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, IBM Cloud, and Alibaba can also be deployed around the world, but AWS is the top in terms of number of infrastructures and services. AWS has the world's largest share of cloud services when compared to the competition. AWS holds the global share of around 30 to 40% every year. They have physical facilities for the cloud all over the world, much more than any other company. For this reason and more, when considering the cloud service options, you're better off thinking about it in relations to AWS. They also provide additional features and services for users, performing support like benchmarking, for example. AWS certification system. In this lecture, I would like to understand the AWS certification system and take a look at the position of the AWS Solution Architect's Associate exam. AWS has a system of qualifications that you can see on the screen now. It's divided into 4 main categories: foundational, associates, professional, and specialty. Foundational is obviously the basic exam for AWS. This is the Cloud Practitioner exam. It's the most introductory qualification exam and is the lowest level. As for the Associates exams, there are 2 other associate exams beside that of the Solutions Architect Associate exam: SysOps Administrator and Developer. SysOps Administrator Associate exam is a test for operation management of an AWS environment. The Developer Associate exam is a test for development using an AWS environment. Each associate exam is an intermediate level qualification exam, which is recommended for those that have had at least 1 year of experience in each field. For this reason, when you take the AWS certification exam for the first time, it's actually easier for them to start with the Cloud Practitioner exam. In addition, there is quite a lot of overlapping content between the foundational exam and the associate's exams, so you can easily be learning both at the same time. The highest qualification for each category, this is that of the professional exam. This exam is for those with more than 3 years of work experience in their field. Of the higher qualifications, the next step for Solutions Architect Associates is the Solution Architect Professional exam. The SysOps Associates and Developer Associates have the DevOps Engineer Professional exam. You might be wondering what the difference is between the Associates and Professional level exams. Associates are positioned at the entry level. On the higher end, professionals will be challenged with the ability to design advanced architectures that go beyond the standard. They will cover unique scenarios that require deep thought about the best approach from many different angles. Because of this difference, the questions in the professional exam will be very long, and the answers will also be selected from long text options. Naturally, the architectural configurations that will be asked about are very complicated. Let's take a look at the DevOps Engineer Professional exam. DevOps is a coined term that combines development and operations, allowing operations and development to proceed at the same time. It's a development process in which additional development is carried out whilst also constantly operating the application. Adding functions as needed is the standard method for cloud-based development. For this reason, it's necessary to be able to do both without separating the person in charge of operation and development. The synergy between maintaining an operation while also developing it further is a crucial balance to keep. In an old-fashioned development process called waterfall type development, it took a long time, maybe 1 to 2 years, to design the system. Then development begins after. Now, as opposed to this waterfall method, DevOps is a method based on the idea of releasing features piece by piece to make them better consistently over time. This requires knowledge of both operations and development, as you can imagine. So it's set as a higher qualification for SysOps administrator and developer. The exams for Solutions Architect may have questions that require detailed development settings or operations-related questions, but they tend to be less common. In the SAA01 version exam, there were many questions about operation management, but in the newest form, that of SAA02 version, questions related to operation management are out of the scope. The remaining qualification exam groups are called specialties. These are qualification tests that require expertise in a specific field, like security or networking. Qualification exams are available for each specialty. The Advanced Networking exam is a qualification to further enhance your expertise in networking with AWS. The Security exam is a qualification specializing in security management. The Machine Learning exam is a qualification that specializes in machine learning and AI setting methods using AI platforms such as AWS SageMaker. Alexa Skill Builder is a specialized qualification for creating and utilizing features such as smart speakers with Alexa. Database is a qualification specialty for the operation and use of various databases on AWS. Finally, Data Analytics slightly overlaps with machine learning, but it's a qualification that specializes in data analysis rather than machine learning directly. There are various data analysis services on AWS. Kinesis, a service that processes streaming data, allows you to create data analysis mechanisms such as EMR, Athena, and Redshift. It is a qualification that requires expertise to use such data analysis services. It's important to understand that solutions architects are positioned in each of these specific systems all the same. With so many qualification exams on offer, you might be wondering where to begin studying. I would like to confirm what order is the easiest. As mentioned earlier, the underlying qualification for all qualifications exams is the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner exam. This is the foundation for all AWS knowledge. If you are aiming for AWS qualifications as a beginner, this is the easiest to study for. Many people suddenly aim for the Solution Architect Associate exam, but starting out from the Cloud Practitioner level is easier. The next exam to take after this is surely the AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam. It is widely thought that this is the next logical step as many of the questions asked in the Cloud Practitioner exam overlap somewhat with the Solutions Architect Associate exam as well. Therefore, to understand these questions thoroughly, taking the Certified Cloud Practitioner exam can make it easier for you to understand the Architect Associate exam as well. After passing the Cloud Practitioner exam, it's often advised to take the Associate exam based on the goals you are specifically aiming for. For example, if you want to prioritize administrator or development, you may want to pass those exams first. However, because the Solutions Architect Associate exam is the easiest out of these 3 associate exams, it's often thought that the next logical step is to the Solutions Architect Associate exam, even if your end goal is somewhere different. As you might know, the SysOps and Developer exams are a little more difficult. Although technically it's positioned in the intermediate level, the same as the Solutions Architect exam, there was a time when there was no Cloud Practitioner exam. During this time, the Solutions Architect Associate exam was in the position of the most basic exam on offer, similar to that of the Cloud Practitioner exam. This was then followed by the SysOps Administrator and Solution Developer exam. For this reason, the Solutions Architect Associate exam is the easiest to pass out of the 3. This is why it's commonly thought of as an easier pathway to go from Solutions Architect and then on into SysOps Administrator or Solutions Developer. Personally, I think it's better to take the qualification test in this order so you can learn the contents firmly step by step. Also, doing this, you're able to build a collection of certificates that prove your detailed understanding of AWS. After passing the associate exams, it is common for people to take the Solutions Architect Professional exam. However, professional exams are quite a lot more difficult. For the associate level exams, most can pass if they do their best and study effectively. Unfortunately, however, there are many who do fail the professional exams using the same approach. As mentioned before, the required level of ability is equivalent to more than 3 years of experience. For this reason, the difficulty level is a significant jump, and the examination range will be quite a lot wider. As a result, it's difficult to pass the professional exam immediately after passing an associate level. This is one of the main reasons why it's recommended to go from the Solutions Architect Associate exam onwards to the SysOps Administrator and then Solutions Developer exam. After passing these, it's a good test of your ability to pass the professional level exam for Solutions Architect. And after passing both of these exams, you can then aim for the Solution Architect Professional exam. This is because some of the professional level questions are in line with some of the understanding needed to pass the SysOps and Developer exams in the associate level too. That means it's easier to pass if you already have experience with these other 2 areas. Also, it helps you pass the DevOps Engineer Professional exam after taking these 2 intermediate level ones. By choosing to pass all associate qualifications in this way and then aiming to pass professional level exams, the chances of passing the exam significantly increase, and you will have filled all the gaps in your AWS knowledge so far. In any case, you must first pass the Solutions Architect Associate exam. So in this course, let's focus on this and set ourselves up to passing the higher exam levels. Associate Exam Overview. In this lecture, I would like to take a look at what the AWS Solutions Architect Associate exam is like following the official guide. According to AWS, passing the Solutions Architect Associate exam will require students to have the following 2 abilities. The first is the ability to define a solution using architectural design principles based on customer requirements. Here, you want to be able to outline system or applications, demonstrating the ability to design solutions and architecture that meets unique requirements. The second is the ability to provide implementation guidance based on best practices to an organization throughout the life cycle of a project. AWS solutions architects are tested on how well they conform to AWS design principles. Therefore, Candidates are required to have the ability to provide implementation based on these 5 pillars of well-designed architecture: resiliency, performance, security, cost optimization, and operational excellence. With the introduction of the new version of the AWS exam, AWS has chosen to omit the domain relating to operational excellence in the test. We will discuss further what changes this has for our recommended content. Overall, it should make the content slightly easier as we can focus even more closely on the remaining 4 pillars. Let's take a look at the recommended knowledge, as it's based on the understanding of a practitioner with around 1 year work experience using AWS. The top 3 areas that someone with this amount of exposure would have experienced before are around 1 year of hands-on experience designing available, cost-effective, fault-tolerant, and scalable distributed systems on AWS, followed by hands-on experience using compute, networking, storage, and database AWS services, and hands-on experience with AWS deployment and management services. The Solutions Architect Associate exam is built around having these experiences. And as for the remaining areas of knowledge, this contains the specific knowledge for AWS-related problem solving. The first being the ability to identify and define technical requirements for AWS-based applications. Next, the ability to identify AWS services that meet specific technical requirements. This is the ability to choose the best AWS service to meet the specific requirements. Next is the ability to create highly secure solutions on the platform. This requires an understanding of security or management using IAM. Then, understanding the basic architectural principles in the cloud. Knowledge of the optimal architectural configuration to implement solutions on AWS is required. Then, understanding of global infrastructure. This refers to the knowledge about how to utilize AWS's global infrastructure using AZs and regions. Next is the understanding of network technology. A solid understanding of AWS network technology centered on VPCs is required. And finally, understanding of security-related tools. Knowledge of KMS, SSL certificates, security groups, etc. is required for this. Looking at the question formats for the associate exam, AWS certification exams have roughly the same exam format, including 2 main types of questions. The first is multiple choice. This will have 1 correct response and 3 or more incorrect responses, otherwise known as distractors. The second is multiple response. It's a question format with a pattern that has 5 or more options, with 2 or more of these being correct. In the test, around 10 to 20% of the questions will be these multi-response questions. So, it's good to imagine that most of the questions being asked are to choose 1 correct answer. Now, let's take a look at the official exam details, the questions to be asked, and the acceptance criteria. The associate exam has a test time of 130 minutes. The number of questions is 65, which means you have around 2 minutes per question, so there's plenty of time to answer. Some people who are familiar with the content can finish the exam in about half the time. However, if you're not familiar with the exam format and approach, it will easily take the full 2 hours. Learning the test itself is such an easy way to increase your overall success. This scoring range comes out as an average value adjusted for difficulty between 100 and 1,000 points. The passing score will be around 720 points, but as I said earlier, the average value will be adjusted based on difficulty, so it's not necessarily 72%. Think of 70% correct as being a passing grade. Let's take a look at the question content patterns outside of the question format itself. There are 3 question patterns in the AWS Associate Exam questions. The first is the simplest question style, which is selecting an AWS service or the functions of an AWS service. The question pattern is to select the appropriate service from the list, such as, I want a database that performs in this way. What kind of database is the best for this requirement? For this pattern of question, there are many overlaps with the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner exam, so it's okay if you think that you'll run into similar questions in the exam. Let's take a look at a specific example of the question type. For example, your company runs an application where users share videos. This application is hosted on an EC2 instance for processing video uploads by the user. You have an EC2 that processes and publishes video, which has an auto-scaling group set up. Select the service you should use to increase the reliability of this process. In this way, we simply choose from the list of options corresponding to a service on AWS. This is the first type. This is the second type of question patterns. You will be asked to select an appropriate setting method for an AWS service. You will be asked questions like, Scenario X has been presented to you, and you should choose the best way to configure AWS services to meet these requirements. Let's take a look at an example of this question type. As a solutions architect, you are building an SFA on AWS. This SFA has a business requirement for sales staff to upload sales daily. In addition, their records should be kept for sales reports. Durable and highly available storage is required for report storage. Since many sales staff use this SFA, it is an important requirement to prevent those records from being accidentally erased due to operational mistakes. Choose a data protection measure to meet this requirement. This is a common form of question, choosing the setting method based on the service specifically, in this case, storage. This is the last question pattern. You will be asked a question choosing the optimal architectural configuration combining various AWS services together. Let's take a look at an example of this. You are building a 2-tier web application that delivers content while processing transactions on AWS. The data layer utilizes an online transaction processing OLTP database. At the web layer, it's necessary to implement a flexible and scalable architectural configuration. Choose the best way to meet this requirement. Questions such as offer options for the optimal architecture with multiple services. Select the architectural configuration that best meets this requirement are often asked. Keep in mind that these 3 question types can be asked. Let's take a look at the scope of the associate exam. This lecture is based on the content of the exam you took earlier. Let's confirm the domains of the associate exam. The test scope is based on the 5 pillars of design we covered earlier of AWS well-architected framework. As mentioned before, the new test version ignores the final pillar, that of operational excellence, allowing us to focus on the 4 other pillars. Let's take a look at the domains individually. Domain 1 is Design Resilient Architecture. This domain is for reliable architecture design. It's a domain that asks how to design an architecture with high redundancy potential, such as high availability configuration by scaling and a multi-AZ configuration using ELB. This domain has the highest percentage, with over 30% of the questions coming from this domain alone. Domain 2 is design high-performing architectures. These questions are about how to design high-performance architecture. The question ratio here is also quite high, around 28%. Domain 1 and 2 together account for around 60% of the questions asked. Domain 3 is design secure applications and architectures. In the area of security, 24% of the questions will be asked. Finally, Domain 4 is design cost-optimized architecture. This domain has a question rate of around 18%, making it the domain with the lowest question rate. Even so, about 1/5 of the questions will be asked from here, so it cannot be ignored. As we've talked about before, the previous SAA01 version exam included Domain 5, that of Operational Excellence, but it's been removed and will not be a part of the 02 version exam. As a result, questions regarding coverage of operational services such as CloudWatch and CloudTrail are no longer asked. These services will be asked when they're used in architectural configuration in other domains, but because they're difficult to ask in an operational management service, if you don't have time to learn these, it's not a priority. Let's take a deep dive into each domain. First, let's take a look at Domain 1, Design Resilient Architectures. From our analysis, this domain is divided into 4 main areas. The first of designing multi-tier architecture solutions. These questions ask us how to implement the architectural configuration on AWS by dividing it into multiple layers, such as the web layer, application layer, data layer, and so on. In AWS, we also design a multi-tiered architectural configuration by dividing subnets and AZs in particular. The second area is to design highly available and/or fault-tolerant architectures. This kind of question asks about how to achieve a reliable architectural configuration. A highly available architecture is achieved by using multi-AZ configurations or a configuration that spans regions. The third area is design decoupling mechanisms using AWS services. These questions are about how to divide the components into distributed or microservice architecture. It's a method of constructing architecture that can process in parallel and improve performance without the failure of one component affecting another. The question is how to decouple applications using serverless features like SNS, SQS, Lambda, and API Gateway. Finally, we have choose appropriate resilient storage. There are many different storage types on AWS, and the question is often how to choose and configure those storages. Let's go even further into each area and look at example questions. First, let's take a look at the questions about designing multi-tier architectural solutions. As a solutions architect, you plan to host a web application consisting of a web server and a database server on AWS. You need to set up a database server in a private subnet and a web server in the public subnet in order to communicate between the instances. But the communication does not work well. Choose a solution that solves this problem. This is an example of the kind of question you'd get about this area. For this question, option 1 is the correct answer. In order to set up a database server in a private subnet and a web server in a public subnet and to communicate between instances, it's essential to set up the appropriate security group that allows communication. Security groups allow you to control traffic by specifying IP addresses between EC2 instances. A security group basically controls the communication of an instance. The difference is important because network ACLs control subnet communication. Be sure to remember how to set up the security group, as it will come up frequently in the exam as it relates to many services. Next is the question about design highly available and/or fault-tolerant architectures. A customer relationship management (CRM) application runs on Amazon EC2 instances in multiple availability zones behind an application load balancer, or ALB. If one of these instances fails, what occurs? Option 1 is the correct answer. The load balancer will stop sending requests to the failed instance. An application load balancer, or ALB, sends requests to healthy instances only. An ALB performs periodic health checks on targets in a target group. An instance that fails health checks for a configurable number of consecutive times is considered unhealthy. The load balancer will no longer send requests to the instance until it passes another health check. This causes the ELB to perform health checks that will detect the failure and send traffic only to healthy instances. Load distribution configurations with ELB can increase redundancy and availability. The third kind of question about design decoupling mechanisms using AWS is as follows. A company needs to perform asynchronous processing and has Amazon SQS as a part of a decoupled architecture. The company wants to ensure that the number of empty responses from polling requests are kept to a minimum. What should a solutions architect do to ensure that empty responses are reduced? In these formats, SQS, SNS, SES, and MQ are often presented as options. Amazon SQS is often the answer for these kinds of questions. In this question, a more detailed setting method is being asked. Option 4 is the correct answer for this question. Increase the receive message wait time for the queue. The problem with this scenario is that the message wait time is too short and many empty replies are returned when trying to get the message to the SQS queue. Therefore, you need to increase the message waiting time. It's possible to adjust the message wait time by setting up long polling. When the receive message wait time second property of a queue is set to a value greater than 0, long polling is in effect. Long polling reduces the number of empty responses by allowing Amazon SQS to wait until a message is available before sending a response to a received message request. Our fourth example will cover the area of design resilient architectures. A company currently stores data for on-premise applications on local drives. The Chief Technology Officer wants to reduce hardware costs by storing the data in Amazon S3, but does not want to make modifications to the application. To minimize latency, frequently accessed data should be available locally. What is a reliable and durable solution for a solutions architect to implement that will reduce the cost of local storage? This question asks us how to choose and configure reliable storage. Option 2 is the correct answer. Deploy an AWS storage gateway volume, configured in cached volume mode. An AWS storage gateway volume gateway connects an on-premise software application with cloud-backed storage volumes that can be mounted as Internet Small Compute System Interface (ISCSI) devices from on-premise application servers. An AWS storage gateway volume gateway connects an on-premise software application with cloud-backed storage volumes that can be mounted as ISCSI devices from on-premise application servers. In cached volume mode, all the data is stored in Amazon S3, and a copy of frequently accessed data is stored locally. You can extend your on-premise storage space to S3 by using AWS Storage Gateway. And that's it. You can improve performance while reducing the cost of local storage. This hybrid configuration allows for well-resilient storage configuration. Now, let's take a look at Domain 2, Design High-Performing Architectures. This domain is also divided into 4 main areas. Identify elastic and scalable compute solutions for a workload. This refers to the elastic and scalable computing solutions mentioned. Elastic and scalable computing solutions mentioned here are auto-scalable solutions. In other words, computing services that can auto-extend are necessary. Next is select high-performing and scalable storage solutions for a workload. It was computing earlier, but this time it's in the field of how to choose a scalable service as a storage solution. Select high-performing networking solutions for a workload. Architectural solutions for high networking performance. And finally, choose high-performing database solutions for a workload. This is database selection. You will be asked to choose a database with the highest performance. In other words, Domain 2 is an area where optimal selection of computing, storage, network, database, and performance settings are required. Let's look at an example question from the Identify Elastic and Scalable Compute Solutions for a Workload section. You are building a 2-tier web application that delivers content while processing transactions on AWS. The data layer utilizes an online transaction processing, OLTP, database. At the web layer, it's also necessary to utilize a flexible and scalable architectural configuration. Choose the best way to meet this requirement. Option 1 is the correct answer. Set up ELB and auto-scaling groups on your EC2 instance. Flexible and scalable server processing on AWS can be achieved by configuring auto-scaling and ELB for your EC2 instance. ELB distributes traffic to multiple instances for increased redundancy, and auto-scaling automatically scales under heavy load. A configuration using ELB and auto-scaling is the best basic configuration of AWS architecture when flexibility and scalability are the focus. The next question is from the Select High-Performing and Scalable Storage Solutions for a Workload section. A company operates a set of EC2 instances hosted on AWS. These are all Linux-based instances and require access to shared data via a standard file interface. Because the storage where data is stored is used by multiple instances, strong consistency and file locking are required. As a solutions architect, you are considering the best storage option. Choose the best storage that meets this requirement. This question is of choosing the best performing storage. Option 4 is the correct answer. EFS allows multiple EC2 instances to access the EFS file system and share data at the same time. EFS provides a file system interface and file system access semantics, such as strong integrity and file locking, that allow simultaneous access from up to 1,000 Amazon EC2 instances. EFS is a file storage that supports strong consistency and file locking, so this meets the requirements. Our third question is from the Select High-Performing Networking Solutions for a Workload section. Here, you will be asked about how to configure your network and how to choose high-performance network solutions. A company operates infrastructure located on AWS's private and public subnets. A database server is installed in the private subnet and a NAT instance is installed in the public subnet. Because the instances and the private subnet send reply traffic to the internet side, you recently discovered that NAT instances are becoming bottlenecked. How should you improve? This is a question about how to improve network performance. Option 3 is the correct answer. Change a NAT instance to a NAT gateway. A NAT gateway is a managed service that you can use instead of a NAT instance. Because the performance, such as scalability, is guaranteed on the AWS side, using a NAT gateway will lead to improvement of the bottleneck found on the NAT instance. You can scale by changing the instance type of the NAT instance itself, but this action does not guarantee the problem will not occur in the future. For this reason, you can easily improve performance and eliminate bottlenecks by changing your NAT instance to a NAT gateway. Our last example comes from the Choose High-Performing Database Solutions for a Workload section. As a system developer at a game company, you are building a database for games that you are developing. In this game, it is necessary to implement a function in which items appear based on the user behavior data, and high-speed processing of the user's behavior data is required. Choose a service that meets this requirement. Option 2 is the correct answer. Elasticache is an in-memory key value store high-performance database. Its main purpose is to provide ultra-fast, less than a millisecond latency, and low-cost access to copying data. Therefore, it's the most suitable database for high-speed data processing, and it's the most suitable for high-speed processing of user behavior data, and it's possible to do real-time ranking processing and item appearance based on the recorded data behavior. This is why it fits the requirements. Let's take a look at domain 3, that is, of design, secure applications, and architectures. This domain is divided into 3 parts. The first is design secure access to AWS resources. The secure configuration of AWS resources and the method of access control using security groups and network ACLs are required. The next is to design secure application tiers. You will be asked about configuration done to make your application more secure. A concrete example of this configuration is that of using private subnets. And finally, select appropriate data security options. SSL authentication and encryption methods are required to ensure the security of data. Let's begin with an example of Design Secure Access to AWS Resources section. A company runs a public-facing 3-tier web application in a VPC across multiple availability zones. Amazon EC2 instances for the application tier running in a private subnet need to download software patches from the internet. However, the instance cannot be directly accessible from the internet. Which actions should be taken to allow the instances to download the needed patches? Select 2. As you can tell, this is a multi-choice question. Options 1 and 2 are the correct answers. The first, configure a NAT gateway in a public subnet, and define a custom route table with a route to the NAT gateway for the internet traffic and associate it with a private subnet for the application tier. A NAT gateway forwards traffic from the instances in a private subnet to the internet or other AWS services, and it then sends the response back to the instances. After a NAT gateway is created, the route tables for private subnets must be updated to point internet traffic to the NAT gateway. This question asks about setting to achieve a secure configuration using a private subnet. By installing AWS resources in the private subnet, it will not be accessible from the internet. So you can create a secure configuration that is not exposed to direct attacks from the internet. Naturally, the disadvantage here is that you cannot access the internet, which is inconvenient. In this way, by setting a gateway called a NAT gateway, it's possible to configure it so that it cannot be accessed from the internet, but the private subnet can access the internet itself. The next question is about design secure application tiers. One company runs an application hosted on AWS. The application utilizes a VPC and 2 public subnets, one subnet where users access the web server over the internet, and the other subnet where the database server is located. As a security officer, you have begun to consider improving the security of your architecture. Access to the web server is limited to access from the company intranet and internet access from employees' PCs, and does not require internet access like open web services. Select the most secure configuration of the following. This is a typical question for designing a secure application hierarchy. You're required to configure the database and web server to be on a private subnet. Option 4 is the correct answer. Access to the web server is limited to access from the in-house network and the internet access using employees' PC, so it does not require unspecified number of internet access like open web services. For this reason, do not install the web server on the public subnet, but install it on the private subnet. And of course, generally speaking, the database should be on the private subnet as well. The last question is about selecting appropriate data security options. A company's security team requires that all data stored in the cloud be encrypted at rest at all times using encryption keys stored on premises. Which encryption options meet these requirements? Select 2. This is a multi-choice question, of course. Options 3 and 4 are correct answers. Use server-side encryption with customer-provided keys, SSE-C, and use client-side encryption to provide at-rest encryption. Server-side encryption with customer-provided keys, SSE-C, enables Amazon S3 to encrypt objects server-side using an encryption key provided in the PUT request. The same key must be provided in GET requests for Amazon S3 to decrypt the object. Customers also have the option to encrypt data client-side before uploading it to Amazon S3 and decrypting it after downloading it again. AWS's SDKs provide an S3 encryption client that streamlines this process. Both encryption methods are characterized by using an encryption key created and managed on the client side. Let's take a look at the contents of Domain 4, Design Cost-Optimized Architectures. This domain is divided into 3 contents again. The first, identify cost-effective storage solutions. Then, identify cost-effective compute and database services. And finally, design cost-optimized network architectures. In this section, obviously the cost-optimal choice for these 3 resources is being questioned. Let's take a look at a question about identifying cost-effective storage solutions. A company needs to maintain access logs for a minimum of 5 years due to regulatory requirements. The data is rarely accessed once stored, but must be accessible with 1 day's notice if it's needed. What is the most cost-effective data storage solution that meets these requirements? Option 1 is the correct answer. Store the data in Amazon S3 Glacier Deep Archive storage and then delete the objects after 5 years using a lifecycle rule. Data can be stored directly in Amazon's S3 Glacier Deep Archive. This is the cheapest S3 storage class. Next is the question about identifying cost-effective compute and database services. A company used reserve instances to run its data processing workload. The nightly job takes 7 hours to run and must finish within a 10-hour time window. The company anticipates temporary increases in demand at the end of each month that will cause the job to run over the time limit with the capacity of current resources. Once started, the processing job cannot be interrupted before completion. The company wants to implement a solution that will allow it to provide increased capacity as cost-effectively as possible. What should a solutions architect do to accomplish this? Option 1 is the correct answer. Deploy on-demand instances during periods of high demand. While spot instances would be the least costly option, they're not suitable for jobs that cannot be interrupted or must be completed within a certain time period. On-demand instances would be billed for the number of seconds they're running. Our last example is about designing cost-optimized network architectures. As a solutions architect, you work for a company that operates a global image distribution site. Currently, the company is considering using CDN to streamline the image distribution system. Therefore, you decide to calculate and report the cost of content distribution using CloudFront. Select the following CloudFront cost elements. Select 2. Options 1 and 2 are the correct answers. Amazon CloudFront's pricing is determined by the following factors: traffic distribution, data transfer and request prices vary by region, and prices vary by location at the edge where content is delivered. Requests, the number and type of requests, HTTP or HTTPS, and the region where the request was made. Data transfer out, the amount of data transferred from the Amazon CloudFront edge locations. AWS Overview. In this lecture, we will learn the basics of AWS, the most used cloud service in the world. AWS has been the #1 cloud service in the world for many years now. It has a market share of about 30 to 40% of public cloud services. This means that the majority of users choose AWS, and so it usually has #1 share in most countries, with the main exception being China, which has Alibaba Cloud as the #1 share. Currently, AWS, Azure, Google's GCP, IBM Cloud, and Alibaba Cloud are the top 5 providers of cloud services. As we explained earlier, these top cloud vendors occupy a large share of the AI services. AWS is used all over the world with its state-of-the-art cloud and AI technology. This is the world's research and development cost ranking. As you can see, AWS has achieved the world's #1 R&D for several years now. Although this list is for the fiscal 2018 year, it was $22.6 billion US, and in the fiscal 2017 year, it was approximately $22.6 billion again. The same amount of money was spent in both years. They have become a company that constantly invests large amounts of money in research and development and is at the forefront of technology. At the end of each year, AWS hosts a convention to announce the new AWS features. This is called re:Invent. This is a substantial event for the industry around the world. The services that are newly announced here often become the world standard, so it's incredibly popular. Understanding AWS cloud services is essentially an understanding of the modern cloud service trends. It is no longer possible for latecomers to catch up with the degree of cloud services on offer here. The systems available now are so advanced that it's much easier to use them as a base. Now let's take a look at the basic mechanisms of AWS. A feature of AWS is that the functions required for infrastructure development and application development can be instantly accessed on demand through the internet. For example, when building a server, actually buying the server will add a considerable amount of time to your plans. It would be necessary to select a server, purchase it from the manufacturer, transport it to your data center, set up the server, and perform other physical actions. However, if you build a server on AWS, you can have a new server ready to go in only a few minutes. In addition to servers, various infrastructures can be built on AWS. For example, you can set up storage for data storage in minutes. A major feature of AWS is that you can use infrastructure like servers and storage within a few minutes, free of charge and immediately available. When considering the options and remembering that on-premise means you owning the physical infrastructure in the data center, choosing to ignore a service like AWS and choosing an on-premise setup can be very time-consuming and costly. However, if you use the cloud, you can gain access to similar infrastructure setup very efficiently. What's more, At first, it's completely free, so you can even use the server at no cost. With AWS, you can combine your infrastructure and system functions to achieve your desired configuration. For example, the EC2 service can provide virtual servers for you to use. First, if you want to build a server, start an EC2 instance. If there is only one server, it may go down when the processing load increases, so there are cases where two servers can be used to create what's called a redundant configuration, so as to protect the system as a whole. To achieve this configuration, you will launch an ELB load balancer to balance the two EC2 instances. This configuration can also be set up in minutes. Say our system also needs to store and analyze data. Since AWS has multiple database services, it is possible to use various databases according to the specific purpose. Here, we will connect the relational database called RDS to the EC2 instance. Building a network is essential. Since AWS provides a virtual network service called VPC, you can divide the virtual network into its own specific location on AWS. This is you partitioning a part of AWS's cloud network for your own use. In addition, if you want to create a website on the internet, you will need to be able to access it by setting a URL. In that case, AWS provides Route 53 as a DNS service. You can configure this route to your designated domain. For long-term storage and backup of data, use dedicated storage that is cheaper than RDS. What's called an S3 is provided as a typical storage on AWS. It's possible to accumulate an unlimited amount of data here. It is a feature of AWS that you can quickly create a configuration like this, such as setting a network, creating a redundant configuration with a server and a load balancer, and creating a database. AWS services have what are called unmanaged types and managed types. A managed service refers to services operated and managed by AWS. On the AWS side, using the infrastructure and middleware associated with AWS. The advantages of managed services are that users can easily operate the infrastructure and easily configure the settings. On the other hand, the disadvantages are that they cannot participate in the management of AWS, so there are restrictions on the functions that can be used. For unmanaged types, AWS provides only basic infrastructure functions, and management itself is left to the user. The users are free to set up middleware and software for the infrastructure as they please. This is a type of service where AWS operates the physical hardware that provides the cloud, but does not participate in the functions used by the user or configuration management. It's great for those who want to freely control the settings, but this can be a task that's often quite difficult to do in practice. Let's take a deeper look into the AWS service. On the managed type service side, we're able to use RDS, for which the database infrastructure and database engine middleware are set up from the AWS side. They will also coordinate updates and patches as needed. When comparing to the unmanaged type service, the user is responsible for all subsequent additions after the server region has been set up. Things like scaling and redundancy that we talked about earlier require the user to configure it on their own. Things like scaling and redundancy that we talked about earlier are required from the user side to do on their own. Because the amount of services on offer from unmanaged types are so low, it's not a very appealing option for most users, and so few end up taking this route. This is clearly because the number of features available for those on managed types are a huge advantage. Services like Route 53 and S3 are also a big advantage. The former being a helpful service that guarantees 100% the availability of DNS server operations, and the latter, S3, being a reliable and secure data storage service offered by AWS. From the point of view of a user, AWS is simple and safe, and so something that you will need to consider. Next, I would like to look at the overall view of characteristics of AWS. A platform-type cloud service like AWS provides users with the functions and services offered by servers and data centers. However, it's distributed throughout the world via the internet. Cloud services provided by AWS, Google, Microsoft, IBM, for example, have data centers all over the world and are globally deployed so that infrastructure can be instantly launched anywhere in the world. This kind of global expansion could be thought of as being one of the early forms of cloud service expansion. Looking at the global configuration of AWS, it has three main categories of geographical distribution. Looking at the global configuration of AWS, it has three main categories of geographical distribution for its infrastructure. They are categorized as regions, AZs, or availability zones, and edge locations. The region is the largest unit. Regions are set up for each country or large area. For example, Japan has two regions, the Tokyo region and the Osaka local region. Since the United States is larger, regions like Northern Virginia are set up for United States. There are about 2 to 4 AZs in that region. An AZ is made up of one or more data centers. An AZ is the primary AWS service deployment site. An edge location is a small data center used for easier content distribution, for example. Apart from AZ and regions, it is used to distribute data globally and provide other functions on top of this. As you can see here, AWS has regions all over the world, and you can instantly create your own server area anywhere using data centers scattered around the world. This is an exciting feature of AWS's cloud services. In the example mentioned before, Japan has two regions, Tokyo and Osaka. Originally, there was only one in the Tokyo region, but the Osaka local region has been added. Only the Tokyo region is freely available for everyone, but the Osaka local region is not available for general users. Let's explore the characteristics of a region. Regions are physically independent infrastructure locations. Therefore, even if one region becomes unavailable due to an earthquake, for example, the distance and functions are separated between regions so that the other regions can remain in use. This allows you to copy your application and infrastructure backups to other regions to reduce your risk. It's important to think about long-term environmental risks like this when it can disrupt your activities so unpredictably. Although there are large distances between adjacent regions, they are connected by a dedicated broadband network, so it's possible to transfer and exchange data between them. This allows two regions to work together. You can also link overseas regions such as Singapore and Sydney instead of domestically. You can also link overseas regions together, like Singapore and Sydney, instead of domestically. Available services and prices vary depending on the region. For example, Northern Virginia is the first region to offer the latest AWS services and features. Even if the latest features are released from AWS, it's not often immediately available in the Seoul region, for example. Prices will change slightly depending on the region, and so this should also be noted. Now, let's move on to availability zones. The availability zone is an independent infrastructure that makes up a region. There are 2 or more AZs in one region. AWS services will generally be installed in AZs, and many AWS services can be used across AZs. Each availability zone is a separate set of data centers, but the AZs are connected by low latency links, making it easy for them to work together. An AZ is made up of 1 or more physical data centers, each with hundreds or even thousands of servers. AWS virtualizes the physical infrastructure in an AZ and provides them to users as services. The availability zone is made up of 1 or more data centers, but the AWS data center locations are not publicly available. Just picture some ridiculously large data center that makes up one of these AZs, and the physical infrastructure installed is being provided as a service in Northern Virginia. Although an AZ is made up of 1 or more data centers, it's not always secure. The situation that one AZ issues it's possible for issues or even stoppages to occur at one of these AZs. In 2019, one AZ in the Tokyo region went down, and some of Japan's major applications were out of service for more than a day. This is what we talked about earlier, with it being so wise to configure a system across multiple AZs, not just one, in case something like this occurs. For this reason, it's considered desirable to configure the application across 2 AZs. By setting an EC2 instance as a server in 2 different AZs and controlling traffic with load balancers, you can use a server between multiple AZs. This is how you build a highly reliable system. However, although physical endurance is improved by straddling multiple AZs, cooperation and sharing between systems may be restricted. It's necessary to consider which services can be used in cooperation with AZs and whether or not there are any restrictions. Next, it is important to select the region. Generally speaking, we would use the region close to the user assumed for the application. If you offer applications in Australia, you should choose the Sydney region. And if you offer applications in the USA, you should choose one of the US regions, such as Northern Virginia. However, there are other points to consider besides just the place where the service is provided. There are often laws and company regulations relating data and systems that might impact this choice. So it's also necessary to consider the possibility of being affected by the laws of the geographical region in which AWS is located. An example of this is the Hong Kong region of China. While it is also used on AWS, the Chinese government prohibits the data from being taken out of the country, which may affect the use of data in the future. It may also be necessary to hand over the data at the request of the Chinese government. You should always carefully consider the choice of region, as you may need to consider such political situations like this. It is common to deploy data and backup systems in separate regions to support business continuity planning, or BCP. It is also possible to back up data and store the secondary data system in another region, so that if the primary system fails, you can recover it from the other region. By doing this, you can mitigate the problems that occur in the region itself. Let's explore linking between regions. Compared with availability zones, there are limited ways of linking them together, but there are dedicated line connections, replicas, and copies that can be created to do this. You can connect between regions with a dedicated line connection via the Direct Connect Gateway, which is a dedicated line to connect regions. You can also have pairing connection between VPCs. This connects 2 VPCs from different regions. You can also specify the regions when creating replications and backups with various AWS services. Route 53 is also another option to create and configure routes between regions with primary systems and secondary systems. This software has the helpful feature of routing between regions if there is a master and slave in different regions that can be connected. Let's return to our list of AWS locations. The third and final is the edge location. Edge locations have what are called cache servers, and they're used for cache data, which is a copy of data for temporary use, making subsequent connections easier. This is used for helping global content distribution and can be used from a service called CloudFront. This is a content delivery system that helps users on the edge to access cached data easier. Another AWS function that is used for edge locations is called Lambda Edge, a programming code to be used specifically for operations at an edge location. Now I want to explain how to operate AWS. There are three main ways to operate AWS. The first is from the Management Console. This is a tool that allows you to set AWS services from the web screen. The website you used when you started the EC2 instance was the AWS Management Console. The second is SSH software, used to operate an EC2 instance started in Linux. This is a command line tool that inputs commands on a black screen. Terminal is for Mac users and Terraterm for Windows. Additionally, for Windows servers, you can use a command shell tool. The tools used will change depending on the server. The third is a tool called AWS CLI. This is also a command line tool. Install the software called AWS CLI in the terminal or command prompt and use it. You will be setting up the AWS infrastructure using these three. The AWS Management Console is the tool for this screen. It is a GUI tool that allows you to configure AWS from a web screen. It is definitely the easiest AWS operation tool because it can be easily set up on a web operation screen. Next is the SSH software for the server. You will use a different tool depending on whether you're using Windows or Linux. Windows servers can use the GUI type tool. Windows servers can use GUI type web tools. The Linux server uses command line tools, as you might expect. SSH software is a communication method and software that accesses Linux servers. It can perform internal configuration and software operations. Since we will continue to operate using a black screen like this, it will be necessary to get used to this kind of setup. Since we will continue to operate using a black screen like this, it will be necessary to get used to this kind of setup. The process for this kind of setup is that you would first install an EC2 instance using the AWS Management Console, and then connect and operate it with an SSH software. And then connect and operate it with SSH software. The AWS CLI is a tool that controls and manages multiple AWS services from the command line. For Windows, there is a black screen operation tool called Command Prompt. It is recommended to install and use the AWS CLI on this. You can use this tool to perform the same operations on the command line as you did with the AWS Management Console. It is often used when it's more suitable to use the command line operation. In addition, since there are settings that can only be operated with the CLI, it may be required in some situations. With that being said, most cases can still be completed with the Management Console. This concludes the basic explanation of AWS. The scope of AWS services. From here, we'll take a look at the results of analyzing a large number of real-life exam questions. I would like to show you the AWS services that are asked about the most. Again, in this lecture, our analysis is a result of 1,625 questions of Solutions Architect Associate exam questions. The question rate and question pattern range for each services are analyzed through this information. The sources we have used for the analysis are as follows. The first is the official AWS questions. We've extracted 3 test patterns provided by AWS as actual production tests. This amounts to 195 questions. Next, there are 390 questions sourced from a set of 6 internationally used mock exam papers registered by our IT company based in Japan. In addition, we've extracted a range of questions from Udemy's top 3 associate exam courses. Based on a total of 1,625 questions, we have analyzed which AWS services are the most commonly covered. Let's take a look at the results again. First, let's look at the top 13 services with the highest question rate. With these 13 services alone, more than 62% of the questions are covered. These are the services you want to focus on to score more points. The 13 services are typically services like S3, EC2, VPC, RDS, EBS, ELB, autoscaling, SQS, IAM, CloudFront, DynamoDB, Lambda, and Route 53. These will definitely be questions that you will encounter, so let's cover these in detail. Let's take a look at these 13 services. First of all, starting with Amazon's Simple Storage Service, or S3, this is the most frequently appearing service in the test. An object-type storage service that boasts a high durability of 99.9% to 11 decimal places. It's commonly said that you can expect the loss of a single object once every 10,000 years. If you want to save the data in object format, you should definitely select S3. It can also be set up as a shared storage, so it can be accessed from the internet. If you want to store a large amount of data for a long time, you should select S3. Because it's a typical AWS service, it's necessary to remember in detail the features and functions of S3. You'll also need to learn about what settings you can choose. EC2 is a service that launches virtual servers such as Windows and Linux. You can choose the processor, storage, networking, operating system, and purchase model. In addition to Windows and Linux, you can build a typical server such as Red Hat as EC2. Next is VPC. This is a service that builds a virtual networking environment. You can select IP address ranges, create subnets, configure route tables, and network gateways during configuration. Most AWS services will be installed inside of VPC, so creating an AWS account automatically creates a default VPC. To specify and create a VPC, it's necessary to install AWS resources such as EC2. RDS is a managed relational database service for MySQL, PostgreSQL, Oracle, and SQL Server, as well as MariaDB. Aurora is a separate service called Amazon Aurora, but you can choose it as a database engine for RDS. EBS is a dedicated block storage that can be used by attaching to an EC2 instance via a network. When configuring storage on an EC2, it's basic to use an EBS. Like this, when you launch an EC2 instance, an EBS is created at the same time. Next, we have ELB. ELB stands for Elastic Load Balancing. ELB is a load balancer that automatically distributes traffic to your application across multiple instances. When deploying multiple EC2s, AWS's basic architecture says you should place EC2 instances behind the ELB so as to distribute traffic. Autoscaling is a service that automatically scales according to the load of an EC2 instance. If the traffic load of your EC2 instances is high and your current EC2 instances can't handle this traffic, autoscaling will automatically scale and increase the number of EC2 instances. Amazon SQS is a fully managed polling message queuing system. It's used for worker parallel and distributed processing. If you want to process multiple tasks in parallel, setting this SQS is the basic architecture format. Select SQS if you want to do parallel processing or polling processing. AWS Identity and Access Management, or IAM, is an access management service that securely manages access to AWS services and resources. If you want to register new users in your AWS account to increase the number of users, or if you want to control the access of users, use this IAM to manage them. CloudFront is a high-speed content delivery network, or CDN, that securely delivers content to viewers around the world with high-speed, low-latency transfers. The Content Delivery Network, or CDN, is a service that delivers content effectively, efficiently, and at high speed. CloudFront is a service that uses AWS global infrastructure to achieve this. If you want to speed up content delivery, you should choose CloudFront. DynamoDB is a key value store and document database that delivers performance in the millisecond range, regardless of size. It is a NoSQL type database on AWS. Next is AWS Lambda, which is a typical serverless service. This executes programming code processing without the need to start a server. Instead of starting a server like an EC2, Lambda allows you to write code directly into a service, save it, and run it. A feature of Lambda is that you can execute code without preparing a server and create simple applications. If you want to start a server and create a feature-rich application, you would still use EC2s. However, if you want to create a small data processing application, or if you want to create an automatic bot service for Twitter, for example, you can reduce the cost by using this Lambda for creating a simple application. Route 53 is a service that provides the functions of a DNS server and performs domain conversion and routing. Route 53 performs the so-called DNS server function on AWS. If you purchase a domain that corresponds to the URL and you want to set it on AWS, you need to set it using Route 53. More than 62% of questions asked will come from these 13 representative services. So make sure you remember the details of these services and how they function. Let's take a look at the next most frequent service group. These are AWS services that have more than 2 digits of questions out of the 1,625 questions mentioned before. If you study up on this range, you will be able to cover more than enough of the possible questions range in order to pass. Combined with the 13 services mentioned before, it covers 90%. These are API Gateway, Security Group, Kinesis, EFS, Aurora, CloudWatch, Elastic Cache, Direct Connect, VPN Service, CloudFormation, Redshift, ECS, SNS, AWS Storage Gateway, AWS Organizations, Amazon FSx for Windows, Multi-AZ. It also includes features related to services like KMS, Glacier, and AWS DataSync. Let's check out each service individually. The first is Security Group. Security Group provides firewall functions to control communication traffic of an instance and an ELB. The security group mainly configures EC2s and RDB database instances, or ELBs, to set which traffic is allowed and which is denied. This helps to control the traffic. Kinesis is a data processing service that collects, processes, and analyzes streaming data in real time. It mainly consists of 3 services: Kinesis Data Streams, which is a service that collects and processes streaming data; Kinesis Data Firehose, which is a service that converts streaming data and distributes it to storage; and finally, Kinesis Data Analytics. This can perform real-time analysis of streaming data using SQL, among others. Next, we have EFS. This is a simple, scalable, stretchable, fully managed NFS file system for use with AWS cloud services and on-premises services and on-premise resources. It provides an NFS-type file system and file storage. API Gateway is a service that creates and manages RESTful API and WebSocket API, allowing real-time two-way communication of applications. API Gateway can create an API to facilitate communication between components. An API enables access from the outside. CloudWatch is a monitoring service that monitors applications, optimizes resource utilization, provides a comprehensive view of operational health, among other things. CloudWatch is the monitoring service of AWS. It's an indispensable service for establishing an operational system in line with the best practices of operational excellence. Although it is a typical AWS service, it's unlikely that CloudWatch will be asked about in the 02 version of the exam. When analyzing frequent questions, Udemy's mock exam course still had a lot of CloudWatch questions, so there are still some, but understand the question rate is going to be a lot lower. Aurora is a distributed, accelerated relational database for the cloud that's compatible with MySQL and PostgreSQL. This is the service of choice as an RDS database engine. You can create a relational database compatible with MySQL and PostgreSQL, which have higher performance than RDS, MySQL, and PostgreSQL. Elasticache is a fully managed in-memory data store compatible with Redis or Memcached. It's a NoSQL type database and is an in-memory database, so it's a service that enables high-speed data processing. You can use it to create an in-memory cache layer in RDS and save some queries for faster access. Redis and Memcached have different usability and functions, so it's necessary to learn what the differences are. Next, we have Direct Connect and VPN services, which are for connecting AWS with on-premise environments and regions. Direct Connect is a leased line service that establishes a private connection between AWS and your data center, or office, or co-location environment. A VPN connects AWS and on-premise environment with a site-to-site VPN. CloudFormation is an infrastructure as code service that creates templates in code and automates the provisioning of AWS resources. It's one of the infrastructure as code services, and it's a service that allows you to manage and share infrastructure settings as templates through code. ECS is a scalable and high-performance container orchestration service that supports Docker containers. If you want to create a development environment or application in Docker format, you would use ECS to prepare the Docker environment. There are other ECS-related services that stores Docker images. EKS is a service using mechanisms of open source Docker. Redshift is a fast and simple, cost-effective data warehouse. You can build a data warehouse on AWS and perform data analysis in cooperation with BI tools. SNS is a push-type messaging service with pub sub-functions. It's used for message notification and alarm setting. You can use SNS to send message notifications, perform email communication, and create alarms. AWS Storage Gateway is a hybrid cloud storage that provides virtually unlimited access to cloud storage on-premise. When you want to extend the storage in the on-premise environment, to AWS or make a backup on AWS, you can use Storage Gateway to connect the on-premise and AWS S3. AWS Organizations is a management service that provides centralized management and centralized billing for multiple AWS accounts. Unlike IAM, if you use multiple AWS root accounts themselves, you can control them all together. A multi-AZ configuration is a highly available infrastructure configuration that uses 2 or more availability zones. This is a basic configuration of AWS architecture. Multi-AZ has no services or functions, but since there are many questions about multi-AZ configuration, I've included this concept as its own area independently. It's the most basic architectural configuration method on AWS. Amazon FSx for Windows is a reliable, scalable, fully managed file storage that can be accessed via the industry standard server message block (SMB) protocol. When using storage compatible with the Windows version of file storage on AWS, select this FSx. The instance store is a block storage that is physically connected to the EC2 instance and is used to store temporary data. If you want to store temporary data, the instance store is used instead of EBS. Also, if EC2 is stopped, it should be known that the instance stored data will be deleted automatically. KMS is a service that makes it easy to create and manage encryption keys used to encrypt a wide range of AWS services and applications. When implementing encryption, you can use KMS to create an encryption key and set it for each service. The Snow family is a highly secure portable storage device or trailer that physically collects, processes, and migrates data to and from AWS. There are services such as Snowball, Snowball Edge, and Snowmobile. The difference between them is often a question in the exam. When migrating a large amount of data to AWS, you would use this Snowball device in order to physically migrate it. Amazon Glacier is a secure, durable, and extremely low-cost Amazon S3 cloud storage class. It's used for data archiving and long-term backup. There are 2 types, Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive. The Deep Archive is even cheaper, but takes even longer to retrieve the data. DataSync is a service that moves large amounts of online data between on-premise storage and S3 or Amazon FSx for Windows file server easily and quickly. DR configuration is disaster recovery configuration. Similar to multi-AZ, it's not a service, but again, we've included this as a unit of the exam content, as it's important and comes up as an architectural configuration. You will be asked about how to configure DR using AWS, such as how to get backups using other regions. CloudTrail is a log acquisition and monitoring service that tracks user activity and API usage. Because it's also an operation management service, it's becoming less common for questions to be asked independently. However, because it's a fairly typical service, it's still necessary to somewhat remember what kind of function it has. By studying the services up until this point, you'll be able to cover most of the questions in the Solutions Architect Associate exam. Finally, let's check the remaining services with 4 or more questions. If you add up all this content, including these areas too, it covers 97% of the questions. This is easily enough to have a huge advantage going into the exam. However, as you can tell, the questions here are asked very infrequently. So, if you're low on time, I recommend that you choose these to be the first to ignore, spending more time focusing inward on the core content. Let's take a look at each of these. AWS WAF is a web application firewall that protects web applications or APIs from common web vulnerabilities like SQL injection and cross-site scripting. AWS Global Accelerator uses 2 global static IPs to automatically reroute traffic to the closest, healthy endpoint, improving internet user performance by up to 60%. With a wide variety of users globally, you can use this global accelerator to improve access, such as lowering routing and traffic latency. Elastic Beanstalk is a service that deploys web applications using Java, .NET, PHP, Node.js, Python, Ruby, Go, and Docker, and automates version control. Amazon EMR can perform petabyte scale analysis with Apache Spark, Apache Hive, Apache HBase, Apache Flink, Apache Hudi, and Presto. ACM is a service that provisions, manages, and deploys secure socket layer, transport layer security, SSL and TLS certificates. When performing HTTPS communication on AWS, you can manage HTTPS communication by creating an SSL or TLS certificate using ACM and setting this in the ELB. AWS OpsWork is a configuration management service that allows you to automate server configurations using Chef and Puppet code. You can manage the infrastructure configuration like CloudFormation, but the main feature is that you can use open source management tools like Chef and Puppet. AWS Database Migration Service, or DMS. This is a database migration tool that enables you to safely migrate your database to AWS in a short period of time. Use DMS, for example, when migrating on-premise databases to AWS. It also is used for inter-database migration, like moving data from RDS to Redshift. Cognito is a service that allows you to quickly and easily add user sign-up, sign-in, and access control capabilities to web and mobile apps. When creating a sign-in function on an application, it can be created using Cognito. Athena is an interactive query service that you can use to easily analyze data in S3 using standard SQL. It's often used with questions such as, which service do you easily analyze S3 using standard queries in the test? Amazon MQ is a managed message broker service compatible with Apache ActiveMQ that allows you to use message brokers in the cloud using industry standard APIs and protocols. There are messaging services such as SQS and SNS, but if you're using Apache ActiveMQ in your on-premise environment, you can use this MQ to migrate the messaging process. AWS Directory Service is a service that enables you to integrate with AD in your on-premise environment or build a new AD on AWS to manage Active Directories, or integrating it to create a hybrid user management environment. AWS SSO is a service that facilitates centralized management of access to multiple AWS accounts and business applications. It also provides users with a single sign-on access. If you want to use single sign-on access with AWS, use the Active Directory service and this SSO service together. Amazon FSx for Lustre is a high-performance shared storage ideal for many workloads like machine learning, high-performance computing, HPC, video rendering, and financial simulation. Use this Lustre as the storage layer for high-performance computing. Lustre itself is an open source mechanism, but it's a service that makes it easy to use on AWS. AWS Transit Gateway is a service that configures hub and spokes through a central hub when interconnecting multiple VPCs and on-premise networks. Connecting many VPCs with VPC peering can be quite annoying. With Transit Gateway, you can easily connect many VPCs and even on-premise networks together. AWS Step Function is a serverless workflow creation and management service that allows you to create processes by arranging AWS Lambda functions and multiple AWS services as flows. This is a service similar to SWF. but it's easier to create the workflows compared to SWS, so it's usually prioritized. Amazon Simple Workflow, or SWF, is a workflow creation and management service that builds, runs, and scales background jobs with parallel or consecutive steps. Step function is a new service replacing SWF, so AWS recommends using step functions. However, some workflows still require SWF. Cloud HSM. This is a hardware-based key storage that manages encryption keys using FIPS 140-2 Level 3 certified HSMs. These are used for compliance with industry standards like PKCS #11, JCE, and CNG libraries. If you need to manage encryption keys securely, use this Cloud HSM. AWS Security Token Service, or STS, is an authentication service that allows authenticated users, like IAM users, to request temporary restricted privilege credentials. In cases where temporary authentication information is required, setup using STS is also required. Next steps to success. In this lecture, I'll be introducing our course specifically designed for you to pass the Associate's exam in the shortest possible time. AWS Solutions Architect Associate Shortest Path to Success course. Udemy has two types of AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam courses. The first type are courses that focus on hands-on learning, going into extreme detail into the menus and physical application of the AWS services themselves. The other type is the practice test courses. Many of these simply consist of around 5 practice exams, offering around 300 questions, giving you a taste of the exam itself. The hands-on courses alone are easily 20 to 30 hours long. On top of this, if you're personally joining in on the hands-on activities yourself, you'll easily add more hours to this total. While it is helpful to understand the quirks of AWS's navigation itself, hands-on alone isn't enough to cover the needed understanding of the exam. So in the end, you will likely have to purchase a practice test course and take multiple practice exams and condense your hands-on knowledge into the most relevant areas yourself. With this detailed and expansive approach, it will easily take at least 40 hours to complete. On the other hand, if you focus on the practice test courses alone, the disadvantage is that you don't have sufficient knowledge related to the content you're tested on. Also, even though there are around 300 questions in most of these tests, it's still an inefficient tool to learn, and any impressions you'll get about the content that will actually appear in the exam won't be as accurate. They're a good way to gauge your current ability, but they aren't the best way to prepare. Our goal with this course, our AWS Solutions Architect Associate Shortest Path to Success course, includes the 3 following key points. Based on the analysis results of 1,625 exam questions, we provide an accurate breakdown of the exam content, areas to focus on, and question types, giving you the structure to base your preparation. We then cover these core services, their content and usage in detail, based on the exam questions without the need for lengthy hands-on demonstrations. Simple, concise, and exactly what you need in the exam. We then provide our own practice test with around 300 high-quality questions designed as a representative sample of the exam, as well as a way to implement your comprehensive knowledge about AWS services. This will ensure that you have everything you need to pass the associate exam efficiently with the shortest time and effort while still getting a great score. Let's cover S3 as an example. The typical function and questioning tendencies extracted from the 1,600 questions about S3 are as follows. S3 storage features. You'll be asked to select storage that meets the storage requirements of a given scenario. You'll be asked to answer the characteristics of S3. Next, S3 data capacity limit. You'll be asked simple questions about the data capacity of S3. Select storage type. You will be asked to select an S3 storage class that meets your scenario's storage requirements. You'll be asked about scenarios relating to life cycle management. S3 usage costs. You will be asked about the cost factor of using S3. You might also be asked for a function that allows you to set billing according to a request. Lifecycle management. Questions are often asked about the appropriate setting method to move or delete data based on the lifecycle management according to the data storage time given in the scenario. From the results of an analysis based on, like I said, 1,600 questions in this way, we will first check the question tendencies for each service. On top of that, you can gain even deeper understanding by recapping all of the detailed information about each area, followed up by example questions. For example, the question of choosing a storage type earlier is actually a question that looks a lot like this. As you study each service, we will provide questions to both show you the style of wording and also practice your own understanding of the relevant content. So here is the example question. As a solutions architect, you're building a mechanism to store and share reports generated by your internal applications. This report will be generated by AWS step functions to automate the generation process, but it will generate several terabytes of data to be used in a report and must be stored in S3. As a solutions architect, choose the most cost-effective storage type. For this course, questions will be given as examples in the lecture, but in order to save time, we'll omit the time to explain the answers in detail. Usually these questions are a reflection of the content we've already covered, so they are quite simple. Instead, the answers will be recorded in the final mock exam lecture. So we recommend that you follow up on these questions in the final exam as a comprehensive review. In order to answer this kind of question correctly, you'll find that it's necessary to learn the characteristics of each storage type, such as the characteristics of standard storage, that of standard IA, and of one-zone IA. This question asks about suitable storing for large amounts of frequently used data in S3, so select the standard. In this case, we would select standard for these kinds of scenarios. However, if you wanted to store data that you do not access frequently, which storage class should you use? You would use the standard IA or one-zone IA for infrequently accessed data. Finally, we offer all of the questions explained so far within our mock exam for a comprehensive review. As a practice of the condensed information we've covered in this lecture, it will be the best way to prepare for the AWS Certified Solutions Architect exam. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. We strongly recommend that you take this course and achieve your goals of passing the AWS Associates exam in the shortest possible time.